In this video, we're going to cover Super Nintendo emulation on the PC version of Retroarch. Alright everybody, SNES Emulation. This is probably one of my favorite systems to emulate just because I have so much nostalgia for the system, but the emulation is also just completely top-notch thanks to the efforts of Nier back when they were still with us. But that being said, I do recommend using the BSNES Core just because it is the most accurate Super Nintendo emulation you are ever going to find, and you will be able to play 99.9% of all Super Nintendo games without any issues. And so I'm going to showcase it to you today in this video, so let's go ahead and get started. To get started with Super Nintendo emulation on the PC version of Retroarch, you need to install the PC version of Retroarch if you have not already done so. So I will have links in the description to my guides on how to get Retroarch set up on the standalone version for PC as well as the Steam version. So follow along with these videos, get Retroarch installed, set up, and then continue along with this tutorial so that way everything is just going to work nicely for you. Now, the only prerequisite we need to emulate Super Nintendo games is to source Super Nintendo games, and there are a ton of ways to do this. You can dump them from an SNES Classic, you can rip them from a modded Wii or Wii U, or if you have physical cartridges, you can use something like the Retro Blaster Programmer to dump them with the SNES attachment. I don't really care which way you go about doing it, but as always, this channel does not provide illegal download links, so if you need to illegally download them, you can search on Google and figure it out. But once you have your games sourced, you just put them anywhere you want on your hard drive. It doesn't matter where they go. So for my demonstration purposes, I'm just going to add them to my games folder in my Retroarch demonstration folder here on the desktop. So once you have your games ready to go, just go ahead and boot up into Retroarch, and we are going to get the BSNES Core downloaded. So here we go, Retroarch. And once Retroarch has finished loading up, just head into the online updater, Core Downloader, then press the right arrow key on your keyboard or a controller to scroll down to Nintendo, and then we are looking for SNES, BSNES. And once that core is finished downloading, we could just back out to the main menu and begin loading up our Super Nintendo content. So one method of doing so, go into your load option here, navigate to the folder where your games are stored. Select a game, and it should automatically load up. If it's zipped, you might have to choose a core to run it in, but there we go. Super Nintendo games up and running on the PC version of Retroarch. Now, personally, I'm not a big fan of that method. It's a bit long-winded, so what I like to do instead is make a games playlist to easily access my games. So my favorite method of doing so on the PC version of Retroarch is to head into Show Desktop Menu, so you can click on it on the main menu or press F5 on your keyboard to bring it up. And once the desktop menu is finished loading up, just right-click over here in the content browser, New Playlist, type in Nintendo, space dash space, Super Nintendo Entertainment System. And now over on the left, you'll be greeted by a new Super Nintendo playlist entry with a Super Famicom logo, so pretty cool stuff. So right click in the white space here, add folder, navigate to the directory where your games are stored, select folder, core, BSNES, database, Nintendo, Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and press OK. Now you'll be greeted by all of your Super Nintendo games that you had in that folder. And if desired, you could pretty up this playlist by right-clicking on the playlist entry, download all thumbnails, this playlist, and as long as your games are named correctly, it should find thumbnails for them. Chances are it might not find them if they are not named correctly. Typically, it's looking for the game name followed by a region code. And sometimes it might get angry about the language selection or revision if you ran them through good set. So just be aware of that. You might have to manually rename a few things. Or if you have homebrew releases, it won't find entries for those most likely. But you could scroll through, see which ones it was able to find cover arts for. So for example, my Final Fantasy IV here, I think this was a USA version. Can add the region code to that one and then tell it to download the thumbnail, and hey, there we go. So for me, it was able to find all of my retail games, but it didn't find cover arts for my homebrew ones or re-releases, so for example, Chips Challenge and Undercover Cops. So in instances like these, you can just search up new cover art for your games, so I'm going to add in a Chips Challenge cover art. Unfortunately, I couldn't find just a nicer solo Super Nintendo one. So I'm just going to make a print screen of this. Open up Paint, paste it in, and I'm going to select the Super Nintendo box art here to use for my box arts. And there we go, that's good enough for now. And then just save it as a PNG picture so that way you can add it into RetroArch. You don't need to name it anything in particular, just get it saved as a PNG format picture. Now select the game in question in your desktop menu and drag the box art into the box art field here, and it will apply it to your game. So there we go, now my Chips Challenge has a cover art. So once you're done creating your playlist and getting thumbnails added if you desire, close out of the desktop menu, press F on your keyboard to full screen RetroArch, and now to get your new Super Nintendo playlist entry to show up, just click on Restart RetroArch in the main menu. Now over on the left, you have a new Super Nintendo Entertainment playlist entry complete with all of your games, and box art if you added it. And then from here you could just select a game and tell it to run. And there we go, Super Nintendo games up and running on the PC version of RetroArch using the BSNES Core. Now, this being emulation, there are a few more things we could do with this core if desired, so from this point on in the video, we're going to talk about advanced core options. So pressing F1 on your keyboard or the guide button on your controller will bring up the RetroArch quick menu. Now from here, scroll down to core options, and our first set of options are in the video tab here. So we could change our aspect ratio between auto, pixel perfect, 4:3, NTSC, or PAL variants. So pixel perfect will give you an 8:7 aspect ratio. 4:3 will stretch it into a 4:3 frame. NTSC will convert it to NTSC format, and then of course PAL will make it PAL format. So I like 4:3 personally. Next, you could crop the overscan, and you could select an 8 pixel overscan crop or turn the option off. This will eliminate garbage data in those 8 pixels. Next, blur emulation. So you can turn this option on, and it will emulate some blur effects that were present on older TVs, but you can leave it off if you don't want to have that effect. It can be useful for transparency effects in some titles. Next, PPU fast mode. You can leave this one on if you want to use some other effects like HD mode 7, no sprite limits, and de-interlacing. Or you can turn it off if you want to have the most accurate emulation possible, but you'll notice that it gets rid of some options here. So, with the option on, you get PPU de-interlacing. So basically, games that ran at 480i will now be running at 480p. So it's great for sharp visuals. Next, no sprite limit. So Super Nintendo still suffered from sprite limitations on scanlines, so you can turn this option on to remove any flickering that could be caused by that effect. And our last option in the video tab is the PPU no VRAM blocking. So older ROM hacks that were made back in the day of inaccurate Super Nintendo emulation do need this option turned on to work correctly. Modern ROM hacks should not have this issue, but if you're using older ROM hacks, you will need to enable this on a game-by-game basis to make them work. Next up, audio tab. So DSP fast mode. So you could leave this on to reduce the system requirements needed for BSNES, or you could turn it off for more accurate sound emulation. Next, you can apply cubic interpolation to preserve some high range in the Super Nintendo sound font. So personal preference on if you want to turn this one on or not. Just listen to it with it on and off. Choose which one you prefer. And then finally, we have Echo Shadow RAM. So this is another one of those ROM hack options that's needed to be on for older ROM hacks. Otherwise, they may not work correctly. So this one will be a very ROM hack specific option. Backing out, HD Mode 7. So our first option is to choose the scaling for our Mode 7 games. So, for example, 1X is just your standard Mode 7 look, and then you can increase it as you see fit to get sharper presentation in your Mode 7 graphics. So, for example, here is full 1920 by 1080 Mode 7 graphical effects in Mario Kart. So, as you can see, the game is a lot more crisp than it ever was originally, so just a cool option to mess with, especially for games like Pilot Wings, F-Zero, Mario Kart. Next, we have perspective correction, so this will fix certain visual glitches that would happen with Mode 7 games. So, as you can see, in Mario Kart here, turning that option off has resulted in some black lines appearing in the emulation screen that are not here with it on. So next up, super sampling. This will kind of revert it back down to native resolution, but have an anti-aliasing effect on the game itself, so it can be interesting when used with scan lines, but for general usage, probably not the greatest option for most end users. And our last option is the HD to SD mosaic. So this one, you could try with it on or off to see how you feel about it. In some games, I really can't tell a difference, so I just typically tend to leave it on. Backing out, we have emulation hacks and enhancements. So our first option in here is to activate an internal run-ahead mode to reduce input latency. This can be quite useful for those of you that are more susceptible to input latency, but it does require quite high system requirements because you're essentially running two versions of the emulator in one, so it can be quite intensive. And then the number of frames that you run ahead can also result in some interesting visual glitches sometimes, so do be aware of that as you begin messing with the internal run ahead. But the more frames you run ahead, the bigger performance hit you're going to encounter. So do be aware of it, but 1 or 2 frames should be good for most use cases, or you could just leave it off if you don't really have any problems with input latency. Next, coprocessor's fast mode, so if you want to have it more accurate, you can turn it off. If you want it to be faster, you can leave it on. And then we could choose whether or not we are using high-level emulated coprocessors, or if you want to put in BIOS files for all of the individual Super Nintendo coprocessors. I didn't cover that in this video because the high-level emulated ones are really well made now, so there's really no reason to try to track down all those coprocessor BIOS files. It's kind of a hassle. Next up, hotfixes. This will fix certain bugs in certain games and glitches that were present even on real Super Nintendo hardware. So if you have a game that has a known bug, you could try turning this on, see if it helps it out. Next up, entropy randomization. Just go ahead and leave this one on low. And our last option, CPU fast math. This is again another ROM hack specific option. So if you have older ROM hacks, you'll need to turn this option on, otherwise things will not work correctly once again. Next up, over and down clocking. So here we can change the emulated CPU speeds for our Super Nintendo games. So if you are playing games that have slowdown because of the Super Nintendo's processing speed, you can overclock the emulated CPU to get rid of those slowdowns. And then you could do the same thing with the SA1 coprocessor and the Super FX coprocessor. So if you want to have faster than 10 FPS Star Fox, you can do that here. They are not without glitches though, so do be aware of that. Next, Super Game Boy settings. We're actually not going to be covering those in this video because we can use something else to do Super Game Boy emulation a little bit more easily. So our final options are light gun. So we can turn on a touchscreen light gun setting. So this will be useful for devices that have a touchscreen. And then you can reverse the trigger buttons on touchscreen devices as well. And that's going to do it for our core options. So as always, you can head up into Manage Core Options and save game options files for any games that you want to have specific settings set, but not have them affect other games. Next, we will head down into the Controls tab here and scroll down to Port 1 Controls. So we have a number of device types available from the Super Nintendo controller. We can also emulate the Super Nintendo mouse. So if you want to play games that were compatible with the Super Nintendo mouse, you can do so by enabling it on Port 1 or Port 2 as the game needed. And then in Port 2, you can see that there's also a number of extra devices available, like the multi-tap, the Super Scope, as well as Justifier light guns. So just choose the option that you need for a specific game, and the option should then work for you as intended. And the last option we're going to cover in this video is the use of shaders. So heading into the shader tab, you can enable them here. Make sure you have downloaded them in the Core Updater, and then begin loading them up. There's no such thing as the perfect shader, so just go with any that you enjoy. So in my use case, I typically go with CRT Easy Mode just because it provides good grid lines, looks good on native resolution content as well as HD Mode 7 content. And it just provides a good look that doesn't require a lot of tinkering, so it's one of my personal favorites. But again, personal preference will be completely up to your tastes, but once you find a shader that you like, head back into the shader tab, click on the save button, and then you can save it as a core preset, so every time you load up a game, that is the shader that will greet you. And that's going to do it for Super Nintendo emulation on the PC version of RetroArch using the BSNES Core. Again, Super Nintendo emulation just doesn't get much better than this. It's just the most accurate way to experience the system. Might be a little bit more demanding on system requirements, but that's a perfectly valid trade-off for me, personally. But thank you so much as always for watching this tutorial. I hope it helps you get your Super Nintendo emulation projects up and running as you desire. But if you could all do me a couple huge favors at the end, if you haven't done so already, hit that like, dislike button, as well as that sub button and notification bell so you can see when new videos go live on the channel. Always have loads of content coming your way, and I'd love to have each and every one of you along for the ride. For anyone interested in further helping support the channel and keeping it going, you can also check out that join button here on YouTube or the Patreon link in the bottom right hand corner of the screen. A little goes a long way to keep this place up and running, thus bringing this content to all of you. Big shout out to all of our current backers. Thank you so much for believing in what we do here and helping us keep it going. Y'all are the truest of champs. Can't thank you enough. But until next time, my wonderful internet peeps, you all stay awesome, keep on gaming, and we'll see you back next video.